Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. 2024 has already demonstrated that the England and Wales justice system, or as some may call it, the Wales and England justice system, is under extraordinary pressure at present. Many years of restricted budgets, policy decisions of variable quality, and societal and technological changes have pushed parts of the system to a brink of crisis. In this context, the Law Society has published an unashamedly Wales-centric series of papers, From Caernarfon to Caerdydd, Reimagining Justice in Wales 2030, and we are joined today to discuss the ideas therein by the head of Wales for the Law Society, Jonathan Davis. Hello, John.
Evening.
We are also joined by the Law Society's Public Affairs and Policy Advisor, Joshua Hurst. Hi, Josh.
Hello.
And Hannah Newbury, who is a National Board of Wales member, chair of Cardiff and South East Wales Junior Lawyer Division, and also a family solicitor at Hugh James. Hello, Hannah.
Hi, Matt.
So thanks, everyone, for joining us. Before we start talking about the really interesting content of the Law Society's paper, for our listeners who may not know that much about you, John, what do the Law Society do? And specifically in the context of Wales, how do you operate?
So on an England and Wales basis, we're the representative body for solicitors, particularly representing, obviously, solicitors in Wales in our context. We do the political engagement, we do communications, we represent their views to government, and we kind of explain to our members what government is trying to do on occasions as well. There's a multitude of other functions that is carried out on an England and Wales basis. The National Board for Wales is the forum where our members come together to discuss all of these items. There could be anything from social media campaign all the way through to helping our members with things such as cybersecurity, or whether they think they need level 7 apprenticeships or not in Wales.
Thanks, John. I mean, Josh, it's probably a good idea to get a scale of the sector in Wales as well. Obviously, it's a really high value economic segment of the Welsh economy. Is the profession growing in Wales? Are there any specific areas that are trending up or down in the legal sector?
Yes, the statistics are interesting. So we can see sort of a decline in sort of under 30, between 21 and 30-year-old practicing in Wales. We see a bit of a growth in trend equally in sort of Liverpool, Manchester, Bristol and London. So you could quite easily sort of aggregate that as saying, there's a bit of a move out. What we have in Wales is an overwhelmingly high street presence of our solicitors in Wales. I don't have the absolute breakdown as to the statistics, but we have about 3,000 solicitors in Wales, and I think it's about 27% of those are in-house, which is again slightly higher than would be across the border in England. So a slightly older profession than perhaps in England, and an overwhelmingly sort of smaller firm size than would be in England.
Thanks, Josh. Hannah, again, just so our listeners have a bit of context, I'm sure most of the nerds listening, like me, will be acutely aware of what we talk about when we're talking about how Wales's legal system operates. So can you do a little explainer about what we're saying when we discuss the England and Wales legal jurisdiction in our context? Why is it such a heated topic?
I think for the most part, because a lot of professionals in Wales, and I will say myself included, feel that there's quite a bit of power imbalance here in terms of who has a say. So Wales bring an awful lot to the economy and the legal sector specifically. Do I feel that we have enough attention here and enough of a voice to basically compare with the amount of solicitors and legal practitioners we bring? Not necessarily. So I think the reason that this paper focuses on Wales so specifically, and I think quite frankly it's a long time coming, is because we do deserve this equal platform and this equal role. We operate, basically almost the same as England, but we don't necessarily have the same opportunities. Where hurdles can be slightly imbalanced, and we have slightly different problems here, such as more legal deserts, more consideration to accessibility. Those types of issues, I think, need to be platformed in a way where we're talking about England and Wales as a whole, because I think focusing on such a dense population, say, for example, London, and the issues they have, to say that that's reflective across the board and we're doing our job wisely, looking at all the profession, would be completely inaccurate.
I think, Matt, as well, just to add some context, really, in terms of you've got Parliament that produces laws for the UK. You've got the legal jurisdiction, which is of England and Wales, because there's a separate legal jurisdiction in Scotland and a separate one in Northern Ireland. But then, to complicate matters further, within that, you have the Senedd passing Wales-only laws. You have Parliament passing England-only laws. and the Parliament passing England and Wales laws. So at the moment, it can be quite a confusing field for people to understand which laws are applicable in which parts of the United Kingdom.
Absolutely. Thinking about the politics of this, though, like we've discussed the legislative angles of it, but in terms of deciding who is responsible for our justice system in Wales, that is a reserved matter for the UK government. And even though it is an English and Welsh system, the Welsh government have very little responsibility in terms of our own jurisdiction or our own legislative space, despite being able to pass our own laws, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can look at that from a sort of degree of angles. You've got about 170,000 staff members under the Ministry of Justice in London. The Cardiff Bay equivalent is around 6. So numerically, even if you were to scale justice up, you'd need far more staff members to oversee a level of devolution and preparation before planning even came down the line. In terms of those features of the justice sector that are devolved, you've got tribunals, you've got some areas of court. There is sort of a brief smidging of probation there, but yeah, nothing in comparison as to what the Ministry of Justice sort of rolls out in London.
I think what's interesting, Matt, is because during the course of this podcast, I may be fairly harsh on Welsh Government in some places, but to say at the outset, the Thomas Commission report that published in 2019 did say that about 37% of the spend on justice in Wales comes from Welsh Government. So what you have is a situation where Welsh Government is propping up a lot of things to the tune of 37%, but has zero say or zero hands on the policy levers.
Is that kind of what drove you to write this report, John?
But here comes the harshness. You've had Mark Drakeford in particular and the government under his first ministership saying for several years now we want to devolve justice. As an organisation, we've got 3 red lines. We support in principle the devolution of justice, but it has to come with full funding. It has to come with complete interoperability between members in Wales and members in England across the border, and it has to remain a single regulator for just reasons of regulation of our members. But with those 3 red lines, we support in principle, but if we'd held our breath waiting for a vision to come out of Welsh Government with some detail and some numbers, a sequencing of how this would happen, how many staff would need to be employed in Caerdydd Park, if we'd been holding our breath, we'd be dead by now.
A set of obvious questions there, John, and I'll try and take them in turn. You discussed a lot there about what you do support. I mean, one of the things our listeners will probably be asking about is the concept of a distinct or separate legal jurisdiction. Is that something the Law Society will get behind?
Yes, it is. I mean, it's tricky because there's lots of confusion around the nomenclature here. Is a distinct jurisdiction is not asking for a separate jurisdiction. A separate jurisdiction would require completely separate courts, would require a completely separate set of judiciary. What we are supporting is the recognition of a distinct jurisdiction, because truthfully, it exists. There are 88 pieces of legislation from the Senedd that you can point at that are distinct from the legislation that operates in England. So it's not something that's there to be supported or not supported. It's something there to be acknowledged. It exists.
I mean, the obvious question, I suppose, that follows on there, I suppose, is are there any other legislatures like the Senedd that does not have its own distinct legal jurisdiction in the world?
Not that I'm aware of. There isn't another legislature that doesn't have its own jurisdiction or recognition of at least its role within a jurisdiction.
See, there again, Wales going being all unique. But John, I suppose another question, and about the Welsh government is obviously they've talked about the need to devolve justice to Wales for an awful long time, but there hasn't been any signs from a UK government perspective that is actually going to happen. I mean, we're seeing little bits now from the Labour manifesto in terms of potentially investigating whether youth justice could be devolved. But I suppose you have to ask the question, until there is a sign that something is going to happen, especially when the Welsh government are already investing more than they quote unquote have to into the justice system, why therefore would they be putting forward proposals for what it could look like?
Because if you're going to ask for something, if you're going to build expectation amongst the membership, if you're going to build expectation amongst the public, I think if you say you want something, the least you can do is say how you're going to deliver it, and particularly how you're going to make it better from what currently exists. I'm not a believer in devolution for devolution's sake. I do think it could be run closer to the people of Wales, better for the benefit of the people of Wales. But that's not my job. I'm not a member of the government or a member of the Senate, is at least put forward your plan as to how you would see that working. I hear things, I'm an ex-special advisor. I've heard these things many times. If we devolve justice, we put less people in prison, we would save money and redistribute that elsewhere. So you could read, yeah, we'll invest more money in primary care, we'll take it out of hospitals and we'll save money that way. I've never seen money saved. I've seen it redistributed, I've seen it refocused. But no, these kinds of things are very, very high level rhetoric that need to come with far more level of detail.
We'll dive into the detail of your reports shortly. But one of the things that kind of runs through them like a stick of rock is a lack of investment and a lack of reform of the system by successive UK governments. Josh, do you want to talk about that a little, and specifically what hasn't been done in the sector over the years?
It was quite surprising when I first started this report out, and I think anybody who's written a dissertation will know. You start with a sort of literature review. So you go to the market and you see what's been written, what hasn't been written, where are the gaps. And it seemed that there was a wealth of proposals and initiatives coming from what was then the UK Conservative government, but they seemed short-lived. They'd have a shelf life of about 6 months, then they'd be scrapped. And that'd be referenced in these sort of ongoing reports. There was no nexus, there was no cross-nexus between these documents. They weren't referencing each other, despite referencing the same studies or the same ideas. So there was a wealth of information. Anybody could look at it and say there was a lot of proposals. They seemed largely ungrounded, uncorrelated, unconnected, and without significant testing. So what the report sought to do, as well as sort of lay out a foundation of the different areas, was to kind of bring the headline ideas and the headline topics together alongside then ideas that may be working in similar jurisdictions in Europe. So, Belgium, Holland, and Denmark were, economies of scale where they've had issues of the justice sector in the 21st century they've been able to remedy. So, in short, there has been sort of proposals coming in to remedy areas and issues in the justice sector, but they've been uncollated and untested.
I think I got to add to that as well. There's been a huge legacy of underinvestment. Money has been taken out and taken out and taken out. Courts have been closed. No, the plans are great, but at the end of the day, you follow the money.
Hannah, how does it feel to you on the ground as a lawyer trying to deal with the current justice system in the UK?
I think it's very difficult, especially as I'm coming at this from a practitioner perspective. Trying to manage your clients' expectations when they're asking the same questions that you could be asking, it's quite difficult. So from my perspective as a family lawyer, we've got the court system. A massive problem for private family is the delay. There are reforms coming in Wales at the moment, but for example, issuing a financial remedy application on divorce in the event you have some tricky cases or third-party experts like pension sharing, you could be looking at an 18-month case in the court just for a resolution. You've got difficulties still like technological accessibility. A lot of my clients don't own a laptop or a tablet. When they're told to attend remotely, they need to come in. Some clients don't live anywhere near me, but don't trust their high street firms or want that kind of quality. There's loads of issues there where I've kind of got to just say, we are where we are. But it's quite a shame, there are public services where you can natter along and say, oh yes, this is bad. And we all have a bit of a laugh about it. But clients at the door don't expect to hear the same about law and the courts. And I think when they're in it, it can waver their hopes sometimes. Although I don't think that, the integrity of the courts or practitioners is diminished in any way. I think we're all trying our best in a system that is a bit broken. But to deal with that face to face on a daily basis and explaining things that they're going to be shocked at, yeah, it can certainly be difficult. And quite frankly, clients have raised questions that I've added to my own bank of questions that I've not really thought about as someone that's not relying on the system myself.
Speaking as someone who's been waiting 9 months for a probate application, I completely understand what you mean. So let's talk about some of the papers now. So the first paper looked at access to justice and legal aid. It begins with a quote from the Legal Aid and Advice Act 1949, which stated its purpose was to provide legal advice for those of slender means and resources so that no one would be financially unable to prosecute a just and reasonable claim or defend a legal right. John, do you think we're currently delivering on that in Wales?
No, nowhere close to it.
Okay. Sometimes you want a one-word answer. It's fantastic. Josh or John, would you be able to expand? Why are we not?
Well, there's the obvious. Solicitors haven't had an increase in legal aid fees since 1998. I'm sure there is a perception out there amongst your listeners that know all of my members are solicitors, are driving their nice BMWs and living in their 5-bedroom detached houses. The average salary of a criminal defence solicitor anywhere 10 miles north of Cardiff is about 25,500 to £26,000 a year for working very antisocial hours and very, very long hours. So no, there's been no investment there. That's led to less and less and less firms who feel able to deliver criminal defence work, which means if you go past Swansea and keep driving, you're going to be in desperate need to try and find a criminal defence solicitor because they don't exist, because it's not lucrative. It's a market out there at the end of the day. Firms are not setting up to do criminal work because there's no money in it.
Yeah, to sort of add what John said as well, you've got two strands of legal aid. You've got the eligibility, which is the criteria of how you actually apply for legal aid, and then the sort of availability. And in both those aspects, the pot has diminished. You know, it started out at inception, you had 80% of the population were eligible for civil legal aid. That now sits at around between 15 and 21%. We don't have the exact data. Similarly, the pot of money that's available for people, if they were to be eligible, has decreased. So on both accounts, we've seen that civil legal aid just collapsed.
So your paper asked both the UK and the Welsh Government to commit to the development of co-produced, properly costed legal aid programme, which would restore legal aid provision across Wales to levels that would provide actual real justice to all. With all the work that's been done in this area, should we feel optimistic, or do you sense that this may still take some time?
I think it's going to take time. I mean, if you look at the economic situation, if you look at all of the mood music coming out around the prospective Rachel Reeves budget, they're going to stick to the numbers that the Treasury have already got, unless the economy picks up and they go after taxing some billionaires, then we're not going to have the money in the pot to start spreading it around. I think there is the will now amongst the new UK government. I'm not sure that there is the money in the bank to pay for it.
Hannah, how do you find it on the ground? I know everyone usually thinks of legal aid more in a criminal setting, but obviously it's very prevalent in family courts as well. How do you find it on the ground in terms of accessing legal aid for your clients?
It's difficult. So I don't personally work with a legal aid contract, but a lot of the cases I run, the oppositions can be legally aided. I say a lot hastily, as in, more than I would expect. It is difficult, particularly because it can create a massive feeling of like a power imbalance. I have clients all the time that say, well, they're going to get legal aid, so they're going to hold things up deliberately and they're going to allege X, Y, Z. And in family, you have quite a significant rhetoric there where people are worried about saying, well, if domestic abuse is a factor that's going to get me legal aid, I'm going to allege that. Now, I don't know enough about that to take a view on it, but it's a concern that many of my clients have raised because that is something that's taken into account. I think the problem I find with having legal aid opponents is the problem that is on the ground. Practitioners can be really slow at getting back. It can be very difficult for non-court dispute resolution with lawyers that just do not have the capacity to deal with clients on a basis where I can. I can have time to look at 70 of my files a day on a quiet day, just doing emails. Whereas, legal aid clients, especially if you have a demanding caseload and demanding clients themselves, it can create a massively slow process and definitely a sense of resentment when you've got a privately paying person and a legally aided one together. But at the same time, I do see clients that not necessarily related to legal aid, but who don't earn that much, that aren't eligible, that I do find sacrificing their own cases. In family, I have a massive difficulty with saying to clients, you need to litigate this. There's issues of non-disclosure, or there's an issue here where you are entitled to this money. And they go, no, I don't want to go on my own. I'm scared. I'm not eligible for legal aid and I can't afford the private fees. And private fees, when you're earning a medium range income, it's an absolute whack if you don't have any savings or capital. So yes, I can find myself against advice putting forward disclaimers and clients settling just based on means. So although legal aid is obviously a disaster at the moment, where I come from a non-legal aid perspective, those that, in my view, I think should be eligible are also being hit in the same way, where, they are actually sacrificing aspects that the court would enable them to have because they just don't have the means to take it forward.
We won't go into too much detail here, but just because, again, the wonderful nerdy listeners that we have, they're always very interested by comparative examples. how do we compare sort of within and without of the UK? So I know Northern Ireland, Scotland runs slightly differently, but there's also, from what we read, some very interesting examples from the Nordic countries. Josh, you want to talk about that?
So in Scotland, the eligibility criteria, which I think is the most important, the actual first access for people, is granted on a two-stage test. So it's, does the defendant have enough income for their defence? And is it in the interests of justice for the defendant to receive legal aid? That second one being sort of a much more wider encompassing test than was ever seen, I think, as part of the England and Wales legal aid system. That's for criminal legal aid. I think those tests change the framing and change the narrative of that pecuniary entry that we have, particularly in England and Wales. And the Scotland legal aid system is far more successful when you look at the numbers of cases that are settled sort of before court and a lot of the settlements that come out. In terms of Northern Ireland, obviously a slightly smaller population and a larger budget, but again, run on a much more successful system, despite, that slightly smaller per capita expenditure on justice. When it comes to the Nordic models of legal aid and justice, the approaches are far more holistic in the idea of creating a fair and just society. When we look at the sort of eligibility that comes from the Nordic countries, particularly in Finland, we find that they don't draw a distinction between sort of public legal aid lawyers and private practitioners. And there's a sort of wider consensus in the country that everyone, if they play a role within the justice system, ought to play their role in administrating legal aid. And again, when I talk about that concept of eligibility, that's predicated upon sort of non-means testing basis, is consistent upon the idea of if you have a criminal charge and you're innocent until proven guilty, you are entitled to legal aid, irregardless of the charge, irregardless of your financial status. And where defendants are found guilty and they have to repay sort of defence costs, they are sort of reimbursed with other legal aid structures in the country, with an idea of sort of reforming them post-sentence and post-prison. So again, it doesn't look just simply at what do they need in court on that day where they're in, against a charge. It's the whole structure of prison and afterwards that's kind of reformed, which appears to work far better than what we have.
Legal aid for all and equality of arms sounds great to me. John, I suppose the question therefore is, why are we not doing this if it's better? Is it simply a question of money, or is it ideology behind it as well?
I think it's both. I mean, usually the money follows the ideology. Money can usually be found for particular political pet projects. I think Josh mentioned an interesting word there, and that's holistic. We've heard many times in Wales that we're a small, agile nation. Well, we're small. The agility I'm not so sure about, because you could link up social services, local authorities, the law, family courts, etc. We could look at a system that does provide a holistic, better society, of which legal aid, law, the courts are all part of that, more just and fairer society. I think we've talked a lot about that since 1999. I don't think we've really delivered much against it, if I'm being truthful.
Obviously, your paper on the administration of justice, courts and prisons paints a pretty alarming picture, not only of the backlogs and delays and the staffing problems, but also the sort of litany of issues that there are surrounding the court estate. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, no, there's the courts currently, we've got members working in courts where the toilets don't flush, the roofs leak, the heating doesn't come on in the winter, it's scorching hot in the summer. It's just not fit for purpose. I mean, the Cardiff Civil Justice Centre is a perfect example. I mean, you look at it, it is not a shining example of what you would want justice to be seen to be doing. It's just disappointing that this has become an acceptable norm.
Anna, you let out a little wry smile there when talking about Cardiff's court systems. What are they like on the ground?
I mean, they are, as John said, not fit for purpose. I mean, for example, I was in court all day on Friday and I forgot to take a bottle of water in, which was great because you can't get anything anywhere in the court. So unless I get an adjournment or I'm giving evidence, which I'm not, I have to find 5 minutes to try and step out to Pret or somewhere to get water because the fountains don't work. Yeah, the toilets, they can be easily overcrowded on busy days. 10 o'clock or 2 o'clock on weekdays can be the worst. There's narrow corridors, you've got clusters of people everywhere, civil and family context, domestic abuse, families attending to support. It's not the ideal venue whatsoever to have cramped spaces. I could go on, There's not enough conference rooms, disorganisation, needing to remind the court when there's special measures due to abuse as well. There's a lot of significant burden on practitioners, really. And as I said, everyone in there is, really making do, and the will is there, and the service is still being provided as best as possible. But yes, I've never seen a client once walk in and go, yes, this is what I expected. It's no BBC drama.
Everyone's seen too much of the inside of the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand, haven't they, rather than the inside of...
Absolutely. Just take a photo and pretend that you're there instead.
Josh, the report draws a lot on the Thomas Commission's concerns around technology being seen as a sort of panacea for all ills in the court system, but it also sort of paints a picture of a pretty uneven technological progress that we've been made. What's the balance to be had, and what kind of role could technology play in alleviating some of the pressures on the courts?
It's a very good point, and you make the exact point that we don't want technology to just be a sort of an end goal and a sticking plaster that people who administer the court system think if they can get a certain type of laptop or a certain type of operating system on their computers that all these issues will be fine and dandy. There has to be first a stock taking of what we have in terms of technological capabilities of our courts. We simply do not know what systems our courts are using. We don't know what courts are administrating paper bundles. We don't know what the submission systems are for a lot of our courts. So I think first point would have to be taking a stock of what we have. Second, we need a sort of a wider approach in terms of testing our systems out before they're rolled out into the court. Where we have tech systems that are rolled out in certain courts, they haven't been tested sufficiently before they're then put into the court. And there's further backlogs and there's further issues with solicitors using tech. I'm sure Hannah can sort of talk about some of the systems that are ongoing. There is currently a successful family law paperless trial being held in Swansea. It's a pilot scheme that's been run by the UK government, but in Swansea. And so far, they've just reached 100 cases completely paperless from start till finish. And that has been successful. But like I said, these tests are very, very small when they are commenced and aren't sufficiently tested before they end up in court.
So very geeky legal questioning coming here. What impact does our advancing technology have potentially on the sort of Article 6 right to a fair trial that we may have? If we default to a purely on digital style court system, are we potentially infringing someone's right to a fair trial if they have a dodgy Wi-Fi connection? What's the legal ramifications there?
So I don't think the ECHR, I don't think the legislation is quite up to making a claim on that point as of yet. I think I'd counter your point by saying the ability to have properly connected digital trials would aid, particularly in Wales, the population that we have here. Where I live, Colwyn Bay, North Wales, you're an hour and a half away from Caernarfon, the local Crown Court. If you didn't have a car, if you had to rely on public transport, or there was bad weather that day, and you were a single parent and you were administrating one of these family law cases, you're looking at multiple hours before you can even get into a courtroom. So I think a proper digital service delivered where people were able to use those services would help those sort of Article 6 and hopefully help people have a fair trial.
It's sympathetic utilisation. It's not the magic bullet to be applied across the board. But as Josh said, we've got anecdotally, we've got people who travel from Aberystwyth to give evidence in Swansea Crown Court. They leave at 10 o'clock in the morning. They get to the court. The case has been adjourned whilst they're on the Traws-Cambria bus. It's then adjourned until the following day. So they've got to try and get accommodation that they hadn't planned for. And if the case the following day runs over past 4 o'clock, they're stuck a second night just to give 20 minutes evidence. It's not a zero-sum game. We're not arguing that everything is perfect at the moment and how would technology diminish it. It's how do we implement physical and technological solutions to make everything better within what is going to be a pretty robust cost envelope.
No, and Hannah, I'm sure there are circumstances where digital trials wouldn't be appropriate, but probably there are some circumstances, especially when we're dealing with potential victims of domestic abuse, that actually not being in the same room is desirable.
Absolutely. So there's for and against, really. So you can have too much technology. In the civil court at the moment, as far as I'm concerned, it's technological overkill. I mean, you do have the courts that want paper bundles, and if they give you a day's notice and they're in Swindon, that's excellent. I can't post it that quick. You have Mimecast, you have Egress, you have every different system, and some courts accept some don't. If you work in a firm that goes with one program in particular, they ask for something else and you don't have an account, great, it's going in the post. You know, you've got the portal to kind of eliminate that, but, you know, a lot of law firms like mine don't have the ability to hold massive PDFs and be able to email them on Outlook, you know, as if it was a picture. So that can cause a lot of difficulties for practitioners, not knowing what system's going where, trying to remember 10 different courts' preferences, and sometimes in the court who you get as well. But then on the other side, yes, we absolutely need to implement it in an appropriate way. We do have clients on our end that travel a long way to give evidence. Clients or witnesses that are invited to attend that aren't necessarily bound to attend or want to be a bit cheeky, they can be disincentivized by the travel. I've had clients before that are driving their own witnesses to the court to assist them and make them want to assist with a case. You know, I've got clients that come into the office for remote hearings, but then it's fallen against really for those hearings. In the civil court, they're trying to get everybody back in person for all hearings. I understand why. Some of the hearings, in my view, that are there for completely administrative directions and no negotiations, I don't really see a massive point in. However, when you've got evidence giving, we all know, no matter how much the courts say, that the tone of your voice, your body language, whether you're huffing and puffing at someone else on the stand, it can all help your case or lose your case for you. That dynamic is really important. Also, negotiations. Clients are more likely when they're sat comfy at home to be rigid and say, well, I don't care. If they're in person and actually living it right there with a barrister in front of them, they might be more likely to come to the table. So you could argue both ways, but I'm with John and Josh. I think it needs to be implemented correctly, but there needs to be a plan B, if not, that works all the way through and across the board. So we know when we need to be in, when we don't, and when we can make those requests.
I think that's the key point, Matt, is that universality. It's the one system. It's having a system that everybody operates under rather than the multiplicity and mishmash of things that currently exists.
I was going to say that to me is the most revelatory thing that you said in that answer, Hannah, is that there's no one single system that these courts use that allow documents to be processed, which to me just seems insane.
Yeah, absolutely. It is difficult. And that's the problem. I think every court has good intentions. They find a program that works and thinks, oh, this is excellent, we'll lead the way here. And you've got 4 courts leading the way, refusing to concede on a different case management system. And then you've got solicitors, especially, you know, not to be prejudiced, but fairly older practitioners maybe who aren't used to being paperless, thinking, well, what on earth is this name now? I've never heard of this. And especially some accounts, you can't just make it and say, here's my SRA number, you need authorization. And filing a bundle that could take 5 minutes, you've then gone through 4 teams and asked for permission 3 times, and you haven't got anywhere. It can be a waste of time and potentially chargeable to a client that doesn't need it.
Obviously, one of the things that is probably most often discussed at the moment is the role of AI and automation in the economy of the future and our workplaces and our lives. What is the Law Society's position on the influence of AI and automation in the legal sector? What kind of role should it play? And is it a threat or is it a benefit to us, and where the balance is?
In terms of the Law Society's perspective, and I might sound a bit like a politician here, I do believe they've got particular lines on AI that have sort of come from Chancery Lane from the London perspective, and they are quite, I'd say they're observational. They're observing where AI is, and they're not sort of decreeing it as being anything or the other. There is an interesting case I found in the US where there was 2 lawyers who'd put together a case, 2 attorneys, and at a quick last minute, they run it through AI just to get some references, just to get some case notes for their arguments, submit it to the judge. Judge reads it over, calls them in and says, these cases don't exist, they're not real cases. And the AI in question had generated fake cases with fake arguments for them to use. So there's an absolute risk that even these AI systems that are predicated on, you know, reliable search engines, or even some of the legal databases that we use like Westlaw, can generate their own sort of creative answers. So from our perspective, and well in Wales, we're observant as to the risks of it. We obviously identify that there can be some benefits and positives. It can alleviate a lot of those sort of administrative burdens, those easy tasks, sort of calendars, you know, diary entries and invitations. But in terms of substantive legal documentation and in terms of arguments, well, that's what we pay lawyers for, and that's what our members' greatest strength is.
AI is great, and no, it's the sexy end. I've got members who can't get a mobile phone signal who've got to drive 3.5 miles just to be able to phone the court. Okay,
Yeah.
I've got members who are not IT literate who are running Windows 7, which could be hacked with a spoon from Mars. So no, for some firms, AI is an immediate reality. For vast swathes of Wales, from where we are to AI is a quantum leap.
Shows somewhat the disparity, doesn't it, really, in the sort of nature of Wales as an entity. We, obviously me living in Cardiff probably feels a completely different world to the court, having to deal with the court system in rural Carmarthenshire and Caernarfon and North Wales. And it does show the sort of the challenges for any government trying to create investment and legislative proposals to reform the legal system in Wales, that it's not just what we see in Cardiff, right?
Yeah, there's that statistic, and it was a Joe Marty review that was run of the legal sector in 2019, just before COVID. Obviously, they didn't have any foresight, but it was that only 12% of firms in Wales offered any digital solutions to their customers, to their clients, on the advent of COVID. So we had, going into that pandemic at the end of 2019, early 2020, only 12% of firms, and it was only 8% of barristers' chambers, but only 12% of firms offering any digital correspondence with their clients, which is, completely at odds with what the statistics were in England.
So whilst we're on talking about the firms in Wales, one of the papers you have does look at the nature of law firms operating in Wales. What sort of distribution of businesses do we have in Wales? And like the rest of the Welsh economy, are we a legal sector built on the back of small businesses and maybe not the larger firms that, again, those who aren't so accustomed to the legal profession may assume is the common players in the legal sector, John?
I mean, it is a changing picture post-COVID. Historically, it's been kind of one or two solicitors in a high street office has been the huge backbone of the solicitor profession in Wales. As Josh mentioned earlier, 27% of our members are solicitors in-house. So they're working for companies like Admiral or working for the NHS or working for local government. But if you take that out, the vast majority of what's left are quite small firms. But since COVID, given the demographic of our members is kind of 50 plus and aging, much like the GP demographic, lots of firms have been slowly getting swallowed up. So we've gone from lots and lots and lots of small firms to still a lot of small firms, but with more medium-sized firms growing out of that by bringing together some of these firms. So it is an evolving picture.
Again, John, from your perspective, what could the Welsh government do to make Wales a sort of better place for solicitors firms to do business?
That's a hell of a question. The business support, Business Wales, to be fair, we've always had a good relationship with Business Wales. Business Wales, I think, needs to recognise slightly more that the legal sector needs investing in as an SME sector. Josh mentioned the Jamati review. No, there's a big legal sector and legal community in Bristol, Leeds, Manchester, and obviously London. You'd want Cardiff to kind of grow into that. That's going to require a lot of business support. Lots of my members are superb lawyers. Some of them are less good at business. They need much more support in that area. But it's also the wider context. The law doesn't operate in a vacuum. It's the transport, it's the IT infrastructure, it's the broadband, it's all of those other things as part of the environment in which our members operate that need to be improved.
So going back to you talking about it's being an aging profession, one of the things that's being talked about a lot at the moment in Welsh politics is the way we use degree apprenticeships. What are your thoughts perhaps on having a legal degree apprenticeship, Josh?
I think they're an absolute necessity for Wales, not just to compete with England, as we see a lot of our sort of young people travel across the border, but in tackling a lot of the access to justice issues that we have in Wales. A level 7 degree apprenticeship, which would be the full way through from level 3 all the way up to level 7, would enable those students to have hands-on experience in Wales in an area of their legal field that they wish to then go and practice in. And hopefully, if they succeed, a guaranteed job in an area in Wales that they don't have to travel out. When we look at the sort of the population ages in Wales, we have 23% of solicitors in Wales are between the ages of 25 and 35. In England, that's 30%. And we can see that almost every age up until we get to about 65, the Welsh number of solicitors is lower than it is in England. So I think to seek to retain those solicitors, we have to offer them decent education and training. There has to be apprenticeship places and places available for them to go to work. And there has to be support through a firm as they grow and develop, which an apprenticeship would enable.
I think, Matt, we've got to recognise, I mean, my son is off to university. The costs of getting a law degree are now astronomical. You're looking at about 75, 80 grand to be qualified. Okay, I mean, no, it's more than my first house cost. So having the ability, we've talked since 1999 about creating a more equal society. Well, this is one of those. A level 7 apprenticeship exists in England. It doesn't exist in Wales. Just across a porous border, we don't have that ability. We are losing talented young people who can't afford to go the university route into England to do apprenticeships. The thing with apprenticeships is you stay in your area, you build a life, you grow with the firm that you're with, you gain your experience there, you get to know the people in the area and the clients. That gives you roots. That means we can start tackling some of those deserts that currently exist.
I mean, it shocked me the other day, John, because it's been many years since I was looking at postgraduate legal courses. But I was doing so for a member of the family the other day and looking at the cost of the LPC and BPTC, which for the uninitiated are the legal practice course or the bar professional training course. I think I've got that acronym right. Is astronomical. So the LPC was something like £14,500, and the BPTC was nearly £19,000. Now, unless you're getting solicitors getting a firm to sponsor you through a training contract or however, but for most average people, that's just a completely unachievable aim, isn't it, really? And is the degree apprenticeship something that could potentially circumnavigate those very expensive routes into the legal profession?
Absolutely. It's a very simple answer. It's yes. You find that a lot of the sort of scholarships or bursaries that are available for students to do either the GDL or the BTC are very difficult to attain and are often predicated on being able to have, extracurricular activities that if you're from a lower socioeconomic background, you may not be able to attain because you're working after school or you're doing something to provide for your family. So yes, those level 7 apprenticeships are, again, another asset that they have is their accessibility financially.
This isn't just based on kind of principle and ideology. All of the data that is coming out from England says these level 7 apprenticeships really do work. The people doing the level 7s are achieving better results in lots of cases than their degree equivalent. So it's not just that we think ideologically this might be a good thing. There is now a lot of data supporting how good these level 7 legal apprenticeships are.
And another thing to add, a sort of sour taste in the mouth of some firms in Wales, is that firms that have an annual pay salary bill of over 3 million, if they have offices in Wales, that they're paying the levy for these apprenticeships, but they're not able to access. So they're kind of getting taxed for something they're not able to use.
You talk a lot about data, and obviously one of your papers touches on an issue we have raised on the pod in the past in the context of prisons. The evidence by Dr. Rob Jones, who spent years trying to find Wales-specific data about the prison system here in Wales. And basically, for those who don't know, the England and Wales prison system has never historically found the need to break the data up for these two nations. So if you want to find data on Welsh prisons, it's incredibly difficult to do so. But it's kind of essential that we should be doing this right now if we're going to have a discussion about the devolution of justice in prisons, right, John?
Absolutely. I mean, no, the whole for Wales read England, or even worse, the disaggregated 5% number that people sometimes use is utterly meaningless. If we want to devolve justice, we need to know where we are exactly based on data, and that data should then point the direction in which we should be going. Without the data, it's just paralysis. And that is an Ministry of Justice issue. It's something Welsh Government should be investing in. But again, with having a Labour government in Cardiff Bay and a Labour government in Westminster, these are the kinds of systemic things that you hope would be sorted out. It's not a huge cost to get the people gathering this data to properly interrogate and disaggregate.
So I'm intrigued, though, as to why they haven't done it so far. Is it just a question of they've never felt the need? Or is the UK government's Ministry of Justice sort of just unwilling or uninterested in sort of gathering data for the Welsh-specific context?
I mean, these are my personal view, but if with all of the talk around Barnet and needs-based analysis, I don't think the Treasury has been overly keen to expose how big the need is in Wales. That would be a driver. With all of this being driven from Whitehall, I think Wales is in the periphery, and well, why do we need it? There's only 3 million of them. It's not a big cohort, etc. I don't think it's one reason. I think it's historical. It's pragmatically political on occasions, but it all goes to maintaining the status quo of having really, really poor data sets.
So you guys have done some very good work on sort of analysing the risks and opportunities about the devolution of justice to Wales. Josh, could you outline some of them for us, just so we're aware of the discussion?
Absolutely. I'll reiterate just sort of the three red lines that we enunciate whenever we come on something like this. I think because they adequately identify where the risk is and where we need to be in a situation where we're avoiding that risk. So the first one is that we need an adequate commitment to a rigorous funding costing exercise. The first being that we've seen areas devolved to Wales before, transport or health, where a budget's put in place. And we really haven't seen, or if we have seen, it's been a slight decrease in the output that I think Welsh Government was hoping to get from that sector. What we have currently with the justice system is a system that is underfunded. So if we were to receive a sort of matched cost exercise of the funding for what justice is in England or England and Wales, we would be underfunded. So we need to make sure that costing exercise looks at the development over 5 or even 10 years, hence the name of the paper. So first risk devolution, absolutely the costing exercise, the idea that if justice were devolved, it wouldn't be adequately funded. The second is the border issue or an impediment for solicitors and barristers to be able to practice across the border. Like John said, we've seen 8 bills of devolved law. We do have issues at the moment with land law, where we have solicitors sort of in Shrewsbury or on the border practicing in Wales, not knowing that there's been changes to Section 21 housing legislation, not knowing the way, 6 months notices have to be served. And we want to make sure that if justice were devolved and there were a separate justice system in Wales, that our solicitors don't have an impediment where they have to choose, oh, well, I can only practice in Wales, so I best go to England because the money might be better over there. The third one then would be a single regulatory framework. For listeners who don't know, was a function of the Law Society. It split off to the SRA. The SRA, Solicitors Regulatory Authority, oversees the sort of regulatory framework of solicitors in England and Wales. Fantastic body. They operate well between England and Wales. We wouldn't want to see that breakdown where we have separate sort of regulatory rules in Wales over that jurisdiction than we do in England, where solicitors are held to a sort of a different standard. So those, I think, are the 3 biggest risks: the cost, the practice impediment, and the regulation.
Matt, can I just come back as well to what I said at the start? Sorry, is there has to be a provable case for doing it. There has to be a reason, and that is that the justice system in Wales would better serve the people of Wales. And how would that be done? Over what time period? What methodologies would be applied? Without that, it's just asking for asking's sake.
Mm. Well, I suppose a lot of people who are in favour of the devolution of justice is probably more colloquial than it is empirical from me. They tend to believe that prisons, our justice system is broken. How much worse could it actually get? Now, what do you say to those people, John?
It is broken. It's been underinvested in. It's been completely ignored in policy terms since 2010. I don't agree that it couldn't get any worse. You could break it. You could really break it. As Hannah has alluded to, there is an awful lot of goodwill. There's an awful lot of people working very hard in very, very difficult circumstances and environments to make this system work. If you lose that goodwill, you could see it be an awful lot worse than it currently is. So be careful about the idea that it's at rock bottom. It's bad, but it could get much worse. But it also could get much better. As I've said, in principle, we support the idea, but it's show us your homework.
Hannah, I saw you nodding away in the background. What's your kind of impression of it? Do you think this is the lowest there we could reach, or do you think there is still potentially further down for it to go?
I think there is so much further down for it to go, and that doesn't mean that it's excellent at the moment. But I think in classic British style, it's easiest for us to say, oh, this is just, bad, we'll get on with it. And, the blasé apathetic nature of, the English and the Welsh, and we'll get on with it, and we'll, just another day. And I think it's easy to apply that attitude here because, frankly, if you don't know much about law, it's just something else to moan about, something else to see on the news in the evening and huff over. But I think it really could be far more difficult. A massive concern of mine is losing the junior lawyers in Wales. I think there's so much talent. I think they're moving for money, particularly with the training hurdles, the financial hurdles. I think losing them, obviously you have far older practitioners who will end up retiring or are less likely to catch up with the technological advancement. I'm 26 and sometimes it catches me by surprise. So someone who's 66 is probably going to be far more shocked by the transition of everything as well. So I think that, that there is a lot to go here. And actually, it's hard to say when things are quite bad, but clients, I wish, would be a bit more grateful at seeing how many of us are coming to the table because we're purely passionate about this and we want to see this better future. Whether we'll see it in our lifetimes is a complete hope at this point. I really hope we can even start a trajectory that looks somewhat positive. But I certainly think where we are at the moment, we need to just appreciate that we do have a baseline where we could be in far deeper trenches. And as much as we want to focus on getting better, making sure that we don't unravel the basics that we're clinging onto at the moment.
Josh, the report talks about if the devolution justice were to occur, it would need to sort of be an incrementalist approach. But again, a lot of people will be hearing this and again, feeling that if this situation is so dire, then surely action must be immediate and it feels imperative. But why do you prefer this more incrementalist approach to the devolution of justice?
I think there's a couple of reasons why the phrasing is incremental. The first is that where we have seen devolution in the past from the Welsh government, putting it kindly, it hasn't always seemed to be strategic. It seems to be what could be devolved, what would be cost effective, what can we sort of get away with at the moment and kind of administer and run. Justice or the justice sector isn't something that can be thought of in those terms. Like we've said, we've got roughly 170,000 staff members administrating justice in the Ministry of Justice. You could not overnight devolve justice to a staff in Cardiff of anything under, say, 10% of that, which would be 17,000. We don't have that. We have
it's 3 times the size of the entire world.
Exactly, right? We have potentially 6 individuals who are working on justice. The common suggested ideas of what to be devolved first, if anything were to be devolved, is probation and youth justice. I think they, again, that holistic phrase, but they feed into the kind of political ambition of the Welsh government, their kind of structure and thought and policy process, but also administratively, they're quite a good testing ground. Can you get the courts right? Can you get tribunals right? If so, could you get probation right? Could you get youth justice right? Before you start to ask for any sort of sentencing or wider justice powers. So I think incremental for the reasons of it needs to be strategic, incremental because we need full generational costing and sequencing, and incremental because it needs to be shown to be right in the early stages before we have, a lower level of staff trying to administer something which hundreds of thousands of people seem to manage in London.
If you look at the track record of delivery of Welsh Government on transport, on education, on health, even with the legal sector being in dire straits as it is, would I, at this point in time, have the confidence the Welsh Government could deliver something better, given their track record across all of the other things that they've had devolved power over for 25 years? As a huge supporter of devolution, with my hand on heart, I couldn't.
Thanks, John. And thanks to you all. I've got one more question before we leave. Obviously, we'll link to all your papers in our show notes for the I'm sure thousands of people who will now rush to the show notes to read them. But as we head towards the Senedd elections in 2026, obviously still with a relatively new UK government in place, what do you all think the sort of key things that politicians should be doing, both as we approach the 2026 Senedd election, but also probably what will end up being the 2029 general election? John?
There's 2 things for me. Is we need immediately, with the reshuffle, to have a political council general reinstalled. Not having a voice around the cabinet table for the legal sector, I think, is really not servicing the sector very well at all. And I'd like to see in all of the manifestos for 2026 a commitment to having a Minister for Justice. Once you have a ministry and a Minister for Justice, you have a main expenditure group. Once you've got a budget, you then get staff. Once you've got staff, you can start doing things. For those of us who know how it works in Caerdydd Park and Cardiff Bay, that is a fundamental building block that has to be put in place.
Hannah?
I'll come on to a more literal proposal, really. I would like to see the problems in terms of a more long-term oversight, because my view as a junior lawyer is we're so busy looking at what the problems are and how we're going to spend 40 years litigating over it, that by the time we've come up with a solution, there's going to be no one in the legal sector who cares enough, because when they came in with all the problems at the point of entry, no one was there reassuring them that this was actually going to be okay. I think that the focus does need to be on the apprenticeships, the funding, the incentives, retention, recruitment. I really do, because I think it's one of those arguments, isn't it, where if you were to set fire to a room and then argue about who's putting the fire out for that long, you haven't got a room to argue over. And that's what I think is a massive risk here. I think that it needs to be a holistic approach, and we need to factor in not only what are we going to deal with now and how can we rectify anything we've done in the past that's brought us to these issues, but actually how are we going to subsist, and not in the case of, oh, we're hoping that this is going to be a glowing legal sector in 30 years that needs no reform. That might be a bit unrealistic, but how to ensure that the legal sector is something that people who have the goodwill and who have the passion are willing to keep going, so there is something to argue about and to continue to reform.
Josh?
For me, I think John summed up the substantive of what Welsh Government needs to do in terms of its actual policy. But for me, I think what is absolutely needed when it comes to justice is a change in mind, a change in structure of how a lot of these problems are approached and how the solutions are formed. I think there's a lot of successful jurisdictions in Europe, and I think they need to be learnt from. And I think we need to stop thinking of justice as sort of punitive of how we can punish people, and rather how it can be restorative and how we can look whole scale at the issue from charge to post-prison, of how the justice system can be administrated more fairly and more financially viable.
Thank you all very much for your time. If people want to hear more from you, where can they go and find you on social media?
We're on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Threads as of today, apparently.
Yes, I'm very excited to learn all about Threads. I think John's aware I downloaded it just to see what all the hype was about, and I'm enjoying it so far, actually. It's another app I don't need amongst every other pub table app that I have to order beer. But yeah, I've got to give a lot of credit to the Law Society in Wales over this year. I wasn't too au fait with what was going on because of the lack of social media. That's how we get everything done nowadays, obviously. And it's absolutely boomed in the last few months. So it really is worth checking out.
Wonderful. Thank you very much all. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please don't forget to find Hiraeth on all the socials at Hiraeth Pod. You can go to our website, www.walespolitics.com. And thank you very much for supporting us with your ears. But if you would like to do so with your wallet, you can go to www.patreon.com/Hiraeth Pod. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.